Welcome to Research Analytics Hub, where research gets real. In this episode, we explore a critical challenge in Oman's education system. Why, despite decades of investment in English language education, are students still struggling with proficiency? Based on the research paper by Al-Issa and Ali Al-Bulushi, we examine the attitudes of Sultan Qaboos University freshmen toward the basic education system, BES, reform. The study reveals that the BES has shown little improvement over the previous general education system, mainly due to implementation shortcomings. Join us as we unpack the real impact of English language teaching reforms in Oman.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're taking a deep dive today into a research paper.
Yeah.
And it's focused on something really crucial.
Absolutely. Crucial for many developing nations, specifically reforming English language teaching.
Yeah. Our source for this dive is a specific study, right? Looking at the reforms in Oman.
That's right. It zeroes in on the English language teaching reform there in the Sultanate of Oman. And what it tries to do is measure the gap. The difference between the planned changes, the policy.
What they wanted to happen.
Exactly. And what students actually perceived happening in their classrooms, what they experienced.
Okay, so our mission here is to really get to the core insights from this study. Why, after all this investment, this major reform effort, why did students still seem to be struggling with English?
Right. What does this specific case in Oman tell us about the real-world challenges of putting big educational changes into practice? Especially something as complex as language learning.
And it's not just about Oman, is it? These questions feel relevant for lots of places trying to boost language education.
Oh, definitely. The themes are quite universal, actually.
So stick with us as we dig into the history behind it, the big ambitions they had for this reform, what the students actually said, some surprising findings there, and what it all means for teachers, learners, and the policymakers making these big decisions.
Let's start with the big picture then.
Yeah, let's. Why was English language teaching such a huge priority in Oman? What was driving this?
Well, the sources make it really clear. From the 1970s onward, English was seen as, vital, an international language, yes, but also a key tool for national development.
There's that powerful quote from Sultan Qaboos back in '72. It really shows that foundational commitment to education, doesn't it?
It does. He said, "Education was my great concern. Schools have been opened regardless. The important thing is that there should be education, even under the shadow of trees." It really underlines the priority.
It speaks volumes.
Absolutely. And that focus continued. You see it again in 2006, this emphasis on human resources development being essential for building a viable civilization.
And English became central to that vision.
It became the only official foreign language. It got significant government backing, big budgets.
And it wasn't just like an abstract goal. It was woven into the fabric of society, wasn't it? Key sectors.
Right. Business, higher education, media. It was everywhere. And people learned it for very practical, concrete reasons.
Like what?
Well, needing it for science and technology, for higher education itself. Many university programs were actually taught in English.
Ah, okay. So essential for access.
Essential. Plus, travel, getting better jobs, especially white-collar jobs, and even, cultural understanding, like watching international films or news, real-world motivation.
But there was a but. Despite all this importance, all this investment, there was a problem.
Yeah, a persistent one. Students were finishing grade 12, heading into university or the workforce, and they often just didn't have the English proficiency they needed.
That wasn't just an individual issue, right? The study suggests it had wider consequences.
Negative implications for national development, yeah. It was essentially creating a bottleneck in their plans.
Okay, so that sets the stage for the reform. Around 1999, they introduced the basic education system, the BES.
Right, and the goal wasn't just tweaking things. The paper calls it a planned revolution in English language teaching, or ELT.
A revolution. Wow. What were they aiming for?
Trying to really link theory and practice better, improve the efficiency of teaching, and crucially, align with international standards for language education.
So compared to the old system, the GES, what were the big changes planned under this new BES?
Several key things. First, the timing.
Yeah.
English was brought in way earlier. Start from grade 1 instead of grade 4 like in the old system.
To get more exposure time, presumably.
Exactly. More hours, more years. And this was kind of in line with what other Gulf countries were doing too.
Makes sense.
Resources. Huge budgets were allocated. The idea was to equip schools properly. Resource centers, computers, the latest educational technology. Part of the goal was actually helping students get comfortable with technology itself.
Okay, so time and tools. What about the actual teaching content?
That was central. The syllabus. A brand new textbook series called English for Me, EFM, was developed based on needs analysis.
And what was different about EFM?
It aimed for a communicative, skills-based approach. Get students talking, using the language, participating actively.
Less rote memorization, more actual communication.
That was the goal. Using interesting topics, current affairs, paying equal attention to all 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. And it also aimed to expose students to different world cultures through the language.
Ambitious. And assessment. Was that supposed to change too?
Yeah, the assessment procedures were meant to reflect and support this new communicative, skills-based direction. Move away from just testing grammar rules out of context.
And the teachers. They're obviously critical.
Absolutely. Teacher training was part of the package. In-service programs were planned. Teachers were encouraged to become reflective practitioners, think about their own teaching. They even created mentor roles for support.
So on paper, this looks like a really thorough, well-thought-out reform effort. Comprehensive.
It certainly does. A significant overhaul planned. But here's where this research paper gets really interesting.
Okay.
It doesn't just describe the plan. It goes to the students, the ones who actually went through this new BES system, and it asks them, so what was it really like?
The student perspective. That's crucial.
Totally. The study surveyed 141 first-year university students at Sultan Qaboos University. These were all graduates of the BES system, finishing in 2009.
And they were from all over Oman.
Yeah, a diverse group, urban, rural backgrounds. They represented the cohort that experienced this reform firsthand.
So this is where it gets really juicy. What did these students actually report? About their teachers, the curriculum they used?
The survey specifically asked about teacher practices, and it kind of grouped them into traditional versus communicative categories.
Okay. And what did they find?
Well, it was a bit of a mixed bag, honestly, but with some really telling details.
How so?
Overall, students perceived slightly more communicative teaching practices. The mean score was 3.40 out of 5. That was higher than traditional teaching, which had a mean of 3.12.
So slightly more communicative, but traditional methods were still very much present.
Definitely present. The students reported quite a bit of traditional stuff still happening.
Like what specifically? What traditional practices stood out?
Okay, high frequency reported for teachers explaining English vocabulary and grammar rules, but doing it in Arabic.
Okay. A reliance on the first language.
Yeah. Also, teachers asking students to memorize English vocabulary and grammar rules. Though maybe less emphasis on memorizing grammar rules specifically, that mean was lower, 2.16. Vocabulary memorization seemed more common. Training for exams. Students reported heavy training specifically for exams that had a really high mean, 3.99, almost 4 out of 5.
Wow. So teaching to the test was still a major feature.
Seems like it. And also, teachers asking students to just transcribe what they wrote on the board. Classic rote learning stuff.
Okay, so that's the traditional side. What about the communicative practices they did experience?
They reported some positive things, too. Teachers using teaching aids like pictures, posters, that was common.
Visual aids, okay.
Teachers sometimes using only English to teach the mean was 3.4, same as the overall communicative score. So an effort there, even if balanced with Arabic use.
Yeah.
Teachers bringing in extra materials beyond the textbook, using different interesting techniques sometimes.
And student interaction, pair work, group work.
That scored very high, actually. A mean of 3.91 for frequent use of pair and group work. That's definitely a communicative strategy.
Okay, that's encouraging.
And students also reported being asked to do things like language presentations, specific tasks, assignments, projects. Those activities had pretty high means, suggesting attempts at more active, applied learning.
But, sense another but coming. What about the technology aspect? That was a big part of the BES plan, right? The resources.
It was, but here's a really interesting disconnect. Despite the plan and the investment, students reported relatively low usage of educational tech aids like computers and projectors by their teachers. The mean was only 2.75.
So the fancy equipment might have been there, but wasn't getting used much in the classroom, according to the students.
That's what their perception suggests, yeah. A gap between the intended resource provision and the actual classroom practice.
Okay, so that teaching practice is a real mix, leaning slightly communicative, but with strong traditional elements and low-tech use. What about the curriculum itself, those EFM textbooks and the assessment system? How did students feel about those?
Generally, students were reasonably okay with the syllabus content. The overall mean satisfaction was 3.02. They found the topics interesting. That scored 3.23.
And did the curriculum actually push for different skills like the plan intended?
It seems like it tried to. Students reported being required to do a variety of writing tasks, letters, essays, reports, articles, stories, descriptions.
Okay, different genres.
Yeah, and different reading tasks too. Stories, articles, letters. Those activities had high means, suggesting the curriculum materials were designed for diverse skill practice.
Good. And were they just copying from the book?
Apparently not. That had a very low mean, 1.99. Students reported they were not just asked to transcribe textbook content, so less pure rote copying there.
But were there areas where the curriculum maybe didn't quite hit the mark, according to them?
It seems so. Poetry, for instance. Both reading and writing poetry activities had comparatively low mean scores, so maybe less focus or less engagement there.
Okay. And assessment. Did that change feel real to them?
This is where the traditional pattern seems really persistent. Students reported having lots of exams and quizzes. High mean, 3.55.
Still very test-heavy then.
Seems like it. And crucially, they felt the exam questions still required a lot of memorization. That mean was high too, 3.30.
So even if the questions weren't only copied from the textbook you said that had a low mean.
Right, 1.82 for exams being only textbook-based.
The style of assessment still felt like it relied on memorizing facts or rules.
That's what the student perception points to. Frequent testing, focused on recall. The old assessment culture seemed hard to shake.
So you've got a curriculum trying new things, interesting topics, diverse skills, but maybe weak spots like poetry. And underneath it all, an assessment system that still feels very traditional, very exam and memorization focused.
That seems to be the picture painted by the student responses, yes.
Which brings us right back to that central question. Did this big, ambitious BES reform actually change the day-to-day reality of English classes for these students?
And this is where the study delivers its most striking finding, I think.
How so?
Because they didn't just look at the BES students in isolation. They did a statistical comparison. They compared the perceptions of these BES graduates with the perceptions of students who graduated from the old system, the GES, in the same year.
A direct comparison group. Okay, and what happened?
The result was stark. There was no statistically significant difference found between the perceptions of the BES students and the GES students.
Wait, no difference at all.
Statistically speaking, no significant difference regarding their views on their English teachers' activities or the characteristics of the curriculum they experienced.
Wow. Okay, let that sink in. Despite the earlier start age, the new textbooks, the planned tech, the communicative goals, the massive investment, when you ask the students who went through it, the reported experience wasn't significantly different from those in the old system.
Exactly. The theory of the reform, the policy documents, the stated intentions, they didn't seem to translate into a fundamentally different classroom reality, at least not one that the students themselves perceived.
And that disparity, that gap between theory and practice, helps explain why proficiency might not have improved as much as hoped, right?
It strongly suggests that, yes. If the core teaching and learning experience didn't fundamentally shift despite the reform's label, you wouldn't necessarily expect a dramatic leap in outcomes. The practice lagged behind the policy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, sadly. So the next big question is why? If the reform plan was there, the resources were supposedly allocated. Why did this gap between the plan and the reality persist? What did this study suggest?
Well, the paper really points towards the teachers. They're the ultimate gatekeepers, the implementers of any educational policy.
What happens in the classroom depends on them.
Absolutely. Their beliefs, their training, their background, their own experiences, all of that massively influences how they teach, sometimes more than the official curriculum guide does.
So what specific factors related to teachers did the study highlight?
It touches on several things, drawing from the wider research context in Oman. One big one is teacher training.
We talked about the plan training, but was it effective?
Well, previous training programs had been criticized as inadequate, maybe not enough focus on improving teachers' own English skills or on practical research methods they could use. And even the newer in-service sessions were sometimes seen as not meeting teachers' real day-to-day needs or solving classroom problems.
So teachers might not have felt equipped or confident with the new methods.
That's a strong possibility. Many might lack familiarity with things like communicative language teaching CLT, which is all about using language for real communication, not just studying rules, or they might just not know how to effectively use computers or projectors in a language lesson.
And what about where the teachers came from, their backgrounds?
That's another factor. Oman relied heavily on expatriate teachers, especially for male teachers. These teachers might have come from educational systems where traditional teacher-centered methods were the norm.
And maybe they didn't get specific training in the new BES philosophy.
Potentially, yeah. They might just teach how they were taught or how things are done back home, which might not align with the communicative goals of BES.
Well, then they're teacher beliefs, right? People often teach the way they were taught.
Hugely important. If a teacher deeply believes that drilling grammar rules and memorizing vocabulary lists is the right way to learn a language, they're likely to keep doing that, even if the textbook encourages group discussions or project work. Those ingrained beliefs are powerful.
Okay, training, background, beliefs. Are there other, maybe more external factors at play, things outside the classroom influencing teachers?
The paper raises this possibility, and it's fascinating. It notes things like teaching maybe not being seen as a super prestigious career for Omani men, relatively low starting salaries around US $3,350 a month for a new Omani teacher back then.
It is not very high for a graduate position.
No. And promotions often being based on seniority, years of service, rather than performance or innovation in the classroom.
So maybe less incentive to really embrace new, potentially challenging teaching methods?
Possibly, but then it gets even more specific. It highlights the issue of private tutoring.
After-school lessons.
Yeah, and apparently it's widespread in Oman and quite expensive potentially, up to US $25 per student per hour. That's a significant amount.
And what's the focus of this private tutoring?
Overwhelmingly, it's focused on exam preparation, getting students ready to pass those frequent tests we talked about.
Okay. I think I see where this is going.
Right. If the official BES reform is trying to move away from just teaching to the test, trying to promote broader communicative skills.
But teachers can earn significant extra income from private tutoring that is all about teaching to the traditional test.
They might have a financial disincentive to fully implement the reform in their regular classes. Their side income depends on the old system's emphasis on exams and memorization.
Wow. So the private tutoring market could actually be working against the goals of the public education reform, a hidden agenda almost.
The study authors certainly suggest this as a potential major factor resisting the change. It's a compelling look at how external economic factors can really impact what happens inside schools.
That's a really important dimension.
Right.
Now, there was another finding that really jumped out at me from this summary, something about gender.
Yes, that was quite striking. The study found a statistically significant difference between how male and female students perceives their experience.
A significant difference, meaning it wasn't just random chance.
Exactly. The difference was large enough to suggest a real pattern, and the difference favored the female students.
Oh, so what did they perceive differently?
Female students felt that their BES teachers and the curriculum had helped them acquire relevant language skills more effectively than the male students felt theirs had.
Interesting. So girls felt they got more out of the BES system than boys did.
That's what their reported perceptions indicate, yes.
And did the study offer any thoughts on why that might be? Does it relate back to the teachers?
It does. The paper notes that Omani female teachers make up the vast majority, over 90% of the female ELT teaching force.
So most female students were likely taught by female Omani teachers.
Very likely. And based on this finding, the suggestion is that these Omani female teachers might actually be implementing the policy, the BES approach, more effectively.
More effectively than who? The male teachers.
Than their male counterparts, whether those male teachers were Omani or expatriate. The female students, predominantly taught by female teachers, reported a more positive impact on their skills.
That's fascinating. It really raises questions about, potential differences in training or maybe support or even recruitment effectiveness between male and female English teachers within the Omani system at that time.
It certainly adds another complex layer to the implementation puzzle.
So while this study is focused very tightly on Oman's experience, these challenges, these findings, they feel like they have broader relevance, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. When you step back and look at the bigger picture, many developing countries are in a similar boat. They invest heavily in education reform. They recognize the importance of English language teaching for economic development and global integration. But they hit these same kinds of roadblocks. This gap between policy and practice is a widespread phenomenon.
So the specific issues Oman faced aren't unique.
Not at all. The challenges highlighted here, things like making teacher training truly effective and relevant, changing deep-rooted assessment practices that rely on memorization, ensuring resources like technology actually get used meaningfully.
Dealing with external factors like private tutoring markets undermining reforms.
Exactly. And the fundamental challenge of attracting, training, and retaining qualified teachers, especially in contexts where teaching might not be the highest paid or most prestigious profession. These are common hurdles worldwide.
The authors actually suggested that other countries in the region, the GCC countries, could learn from this, right?
Yes, they pointed out that many GCC countries face similar issues. Things like workforce nationalization policies trying to replace expatriate workers with nationals, including in teaching. Widespread private tuition is common across the region, too. Issues with the training and integration of expatriate teachers.
So collaboration could help.
They suggest that regional collaboration, sharing research, sharing strategies could be really beneficial for tackling these shared problems more effectively, more systemically.
It's a good reminder that these aren't just isolated national problems. There are common patterns in educational reform challenges.
Definitely. The success of any reform isn't just about writing a good plan or throwing money at it. It's deeply tied to the human element, the implementation on the ground, within a whole complex social and economic system.
So let's try and wrap this up. What are the big takeaways from this deep dive into Oman's English teaching reform, seen through the students' eyes?
Well, I think the clearest takeaway is that ambitious plans and significant investment, while important, don't automatically guarantee change in the classroom or better results. The implementation is where the real challenge lies.
The gap between theory and practice is real, and it matters.
Hugely. The study really underscores this complex interplay between curriculum design, assessment methods which powerfully shape behavior resource availability versus actual use, and maybe most importantly, the teachers.
Their beliefs, their training, their motivations, even their economic realities outside of school.
Exactly. All those factors influence whether a reform truly takes root or just remains a policy on paper.
And that gender dimension is another really intriguing layer. It suggests experiences within the system weren't uniform and raises specific questions about the teaching force itself.
It does. It points to potential differences in effectiveness or implementation fidelity between different segments of the teaching population.
And finally, that provocative point about private tutoring, how it might actively resist the very changes the official system is trying to promote.
Yeah, that really makes you think about the hidden forces that can shape educational outcomes. How can a reform truly succeed in changing classroom practice towards, say, more communication and critical thinking if teacher livelihoods are potentially tied to drilling students for traditional memorization-based exams?
It leaves us with a lot to consider, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About the human side of policy implementation, those unseen factors, social economic swells that can either help or hinder progress in something as vital as education. What stands out most to you as we close this out?
Thank you for listening to this episode of Research Analytics Hub, where research gets real. We hope you found the discussion on English language education reform in Oman, based on the research by Al-Issa and Ali Al-Bulushi, both thought-provoking and informative. Stay tuned for more episodes where we unpack meaningful research and explore its real-world impact. Until next time, keep learning, stay curious, and keep making research real.